Welcome everybody to the August technical meeting. Uh, there is a class going on at the IWTC this morning. Oh, Gary, will you mute yourself? I'm getting a little feedback, and I don't want to, if you want to make a comment later, I want you to be able to unmute yourself. And anybody else who's on, if you'll make sure you're muted. Yeah, there's a training going on at the training center right now, so I don't know, 6 or 7 of the people that are normally on this call are in that training, and so they'll have to watch this later. So we might be a little smaller than normal, but anyway, so in this meeting today, we're going to talk about Dalton's going to run us through some stuff on the field guide for attic access hatches. I have some follow-up items from last month's training. We were talking about foam plastics, and there was a few questions. So I've been able to find answers to those questions, so we'll address those. And then also, I'm going to go through the changes that were made to the guidelines that went into effect on July 3rd or 6th or 7th or something like that. Just want to walk through those. I know everybody's received a document listing those, but wanted to walk through them and give you guys an opportunity if you have any questions or anything, we could talk a little bit about them today. But anyway, so that's going to be the meat of the meeting. Before we get into that, I just want to go through our production numbers, and in line with production, I wanted to share this slide with you. Brad put this slide together, and he shared it with the coordinators last week at the coordinator meeting, and it's got some important or kind of some interesting information on it. Wanted to make sure everybody was aware of it, and just that it's on your mind as you get into this coming year. So this shows over here on the far right, this shows the dollars in the whole program, or dollars contracted. And you can see it shows the last few years, program year 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. If you'll notice that back in 14, there were a little over $4 million out in the program, and we were contracted to deliver 590 units, and we delivered 618. The next year we had a little less, 401 million. But this is the year that the QCI stuff hit, and kind of, threw a wrench in the works. But we were contracted to deliver 595. We only delivered 477, so we only got 80% of what we were supposed to do. Then in 16, we got $1 million more, but I know Brad was able to make some adjustments to the allocation and stuff so that we didn't have to deliver a ton more units, but we still only delivered 461 units, or 87% of what we were contracted to do. Last year, we had $4.5 million or $4.4 million contracted to do 439 units, and we delivered 385. So we've kind of been coming in under contract the last couple of years. And then this is what I really wanted to focus on is, if you'll notice how much more money is going to be in the program this year. We have $6.6 million in the program, and I know Brad's been saying it. We've been warning everybody, but it is going to have an impact on the amount of units you guys have to produce. If you'll notice that the number of units that are, if you add up all the contracts between every one of your agencies, the number of units that have to be produced this year is 567. That, from last year to this year, that is 30% more units have to be produced. And if you look at the number of units from how many we actually delivered to this year, it is 50% more. So I point all this out to basically say, I hope that you guys are already having conversations at your agencies about how you're going to meet the increase in production. Also, there's been a slight shift. I think there was a little more money moved to the rural areas. So if you're a rural agency, you may actually notice that instead of, producing 30 units, you now need to produce 40. Like there's been a little more money given to you guys to serve the rural areas a little more. And so basically just make sure you guys are having those conversations and you guys have a clear game plan on how you're going to increase your production so that we can stay on track for this year. Any questions or concerns about this slide or what I just mentioned? All right. I wanted to talk about crisis completions as well as we talk about our production, because it is a real part of what we're doing. So I just added a couple little charts to what I'll be sharing every month. Hopefully these will be meaningful to you. But on the left here, this is the dark blue shows the number of crisis completions that were turned in last month. And then the light blue shows the average crisis completions for each of the months. So in July, for the last 4 years, on average, there was about 14 units, 14 crisis units turned in, and in August about 16. But basically, just so you can kind of see, what the norm is, and then compared to what actually happened last month. On the right-hand side here, I did the same thing, but this shows all of the crisis jobs plus all of the normal weatherization jobs. So in July, for the last 4 years, on average, between crisis and normal weatherization, there's been about 37 jobs turned in July, 51 in August, 46 in September. And so you can kind of see, looking at all of the crisis completions and all of the normal weatherization jobs, there were 44 turned in last month. So we're a little above average on the amount of jobs that were actually turned in. So hopefully that'll just give you some point of reference to show kind of where we're at in reference to what has been happening for the last little while. As far as production goes, it's the exact same charts that I've been showing you. I changed the colors a little bit, but basically this light green shape is representing the number of jobs that each of your agencies has committed to turn in every month. So your agency turned in a monthly goal. I've added all those up. So in July, the sum of all the agencies' goals comes up to 34. But you'll notice that we're already a little bit behind the 8 ball because we only turned in 28 last month. So, and then the graph on the right is just a running total. So instead of this, shape to say whether or not we made the monthly goal, this just lets us know where we're at for the overall production. If anybody's paying close attention, you'll notice that this number 473 does not align with the number 500 and something that was on the other screen. Right now, the goals for Housing Authority have not been included on this this chart, so that's all that's missing. But basically, for everybody else, all of your goals are represented here, and all of the units you turned in. So that is a good representation of what's going on. Any questions on production? All right. The last thing I wanted to mention on production. Last month I listed off that Bragg, Housing Authority, and 5 County all met contract last year. I wanted to let you know that Uinta Basin and Southeast also met contract last year. The worksheet that I was using to tally up who met contract and who did not actually had slightly wrong numbers on there. And when we aligned those numbers with what was on their actual contracts, those two agencies did turn in the number of units that were required on their contract. So Just wanted to recognize those guys. We really appreciate all that they're doing, and thank you guys for doing what you did last year to meet contract. Any questions on production before we turn the time over to Dalton to do some field guide training? All right, I'm gonna try and make Dalton the presenter. Maybe. Is that working, Dalton?
I'm not seeing any. I'm not seeing anything on my end.
I have to click yes. Okay. How about now?
Let's see. Yeah. Can everybody see the field guide?
Not yet.
Not yet. What are you guys seeing? Anything? I need to accept something.
I think you may need to, accept some.
Okay. Sure.
There we go. Now.
All right. There it is. You can see the field guide?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so we're going to go over attic hatches this morning. And we're going to be in field guide, the section 4.2.1. We're going to be basically looking at these 3 last paragraphs is what we're going to cover in the field guide. And then I got another section that we might jump into also. We wanted to kind of cover this because it's probably going to come up in what Matt's going to talk about later on too. So I first want to start off with going into the SWS, which our field guide references this, the SWS. And I want to just go over the specifications and objectives for attic access doors and hatches. So on the installation, it says hatches will be insulated to the maximum R value, structurally allowable up to the R value of the adjoining insulated assembly. So as long as you're structurally able to, you're supposed to insulate to whatever your adjoining surfaces are. So if your attic is insulated to an R38, your access also needs to be insulated to an R38. Or if it's on like a knee wall and you're insulated to like an R13, then that access needs to be insulated to an R13 or whatever's going to make it uniform. Attic hatches rough opening will be surrounded with a durable, rigid, protective baffle that is higher than the level surrounding attic floor insulation. So when it's an access through the attic floor, you need to make sure that your rigid dam is going to be higher than the insulation that either is in there or that you're going to be blowing in. And the objective there is to achieve uniform R value on the attic door or hatch, achieve uniform R value on the attic floor, and to prevent loose attic floor insulation from entering the living area. So however you can meet these specifications and objectives. And then it's also goes along with air sealing, and it says attic access hatch frames will be sealed using caulk, gasket, weather strip, or otherwise sealed with an air barrier material, suitable film or solid material. And it's to prevent, the objective is to prevent air leakage. And this options down here, me and Matt have kind of talked about a few different times about locks or latches and stuff. We haven't ever talked about it being mandatory or anything, but in here it's got an option. It says will include installing a latch or lock or frictionally engaged components that do not require a latch. Right now, basically everybody just uses the weight of the foam board to weigh down the attic hatch on the weather stripping. But you can use a lock or latch or something that will pull the attic hatch into the scuttle. So that's what the SWS has on this topic. And then, so the 3 bulletins that I want to go over that cover the attic access hatch is these 3 bottom ones right here. And would anybody out there be willing to read those that's online, or is everybody muted, Matt?
No, they can unmute themselves, so if we have a brave volunteer, that'd be cool.
It'd just be these last 3 bullet points. All right, I'll just read them. Install an attic access hatch if none is present, preferably at a large gable vent on the home's exterior. So if you have the choice and there's not already an attic access, try not to put it inside the home if at all possible, in a garage or in the gable end. And then an interior attic hatch should be at least 22 inches square if possible. Insulate the hatch with rigid board foam to the maximum practical R value. The roof's height above the hatch may limit the thickness of the insulation that you can attach to the back of the hatch door. Build an insulation dam around the attic access hatch 2 inches above the height of the insulation. Build the dam with rigid material like plywood or oriented strand board so that the dam supports the weight of a person entering or leaving the attic. And then the last one, if headspace is very limited at an interior hatch, use fiberglass batts to dam loose fill insulation. And that's this kind of picture right here. You'd have the batts kind of laid around because you're kind of near probably the edge of the attic where the slopes just not, you don't have the height to build a dam like you see in this picture. And along with just this is depicting your attic access through the ceiling. In section, let's see, 4.2.12, let's go to that. It's got the access through the knee wall. So right here, so for knee wall access doors, observe the following. It says insulate wall access hatches and collar beams access hatch to the approximate R value of the assembly that surrounds them. So the same as the attic through the ceiling, or access through the ceiling. Weather strip the hatch and install a latch or other method to hold access door closed against the weather stripping. So on these, you do need to put something some kind of latch or something to hold them shut, because you're not going to have the weight like you do on the other accesses. I do have a couple pictures of what I'm going to pull over this presentation. Tell me if you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
So this kind of shows a before picture, what you're probably going to find on the job. Here's what you typically want it to look like. You got your insulation down here, your dam's up high enough so no insulation is going to be falling in. And then it's a rigid material so people can climb in and out. Here's the steps for that. they kind of lay them out. You insulate the hatch with the rigid foam board to the same R values of the joint surface. You install the dam, you weather strip it, make sure you caulk any of the joints and stuff. Make sure you got a good sealed assembly. And then here's a picture of an access door, a little better than what's in the field guide, but they've got their foam board attached to the access door. They're going to go around and put on the foam board, seal any cracks up, put the weather stripping on, seal around the casing. So other than that, does anybody have any questions on accesses?
That doesn't show all the wires and pipes and ductwork that's typically over the top of that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of times on those accesses, and that's why I see out in the field a lot of people using the OSB and stuff, because you can cut around, you can notch it out a little easier than the 2x10 or whatever. So, but yeah, it's not all real world, the pictures. You're correct, Scott. And along with that, I did add some pictures here too for pull down stairs. It's the same, you got to get you have to have it totally sealed off. Is the objective, and to have the same R value across. And here they built the dam, and they got their layers of foam board to make sure they got the R value. They're going around and caulking all the different joints. And you got to build that dam high enough so that your stairs can go up in and not push up your insulation that's on top of it. So you kind of make the seal along here instead of down lower. So that's all I have, Matt.
All right.
Unless there's some discussion on that anybody wants to talk about.
I got a couple of things that I'll end up.
Yeah, I figure we'll be back into this,
but
once you get into.
One of the takeaways for me from this was that where our field guide recommends that if we have to add the access, that basically we're adding the access that somewhere not on the thermal boundary if we can help it, because then we don't have to insulate it or air seal it. So if it could be in or in an attic, make sure and watch for that, because then it's just an access panel. But awesome.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to take the reins back here.
Okay.
And all right, can everybody see the WAP guideline change form on my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I can see it.
All right.
Yeah.
So Brad issued a weatherization or Utah weatherization program notice about the first week of July, and it just listed out all of the changes that were made to the guidelines. And I know that it won't hurt to talk about them all really quickly. So I just wanted to go through them. I'm going to go through them in this change form because it shows you the reason for the change, the text of the basically what we changed the guidelines to currently say, and then it shows what the guidelines used to say, or in this case, when we submit this, it's we're submitting this to review, so it says proposed change and then current change. But anyway, so where these things have been published, this is now what the guidelines used to say, and this is what the guidelines now say. If you don't know where to find this information, there's a tab on the IWTC website just for the Utah Weatherization Program notices, so you can go and grab anytime they're issued. They're always posted there. well, unless we forget, and then, you know, we put it up a day or two later. And then the change form, or this change log that I'm looking at, we have a link to it right here. So if you ever want to submit something, you can click on one of these tabs and it gives you a form to fill out. And then if you want to see all the changes that have been proposed or that have actually been either rejected or accepted, it's all listed right here. So clicking on that will just take you to this screen, or to this spreadsheet that we're looking at. So anyway, I'm just going to step through a couple of things that were published that pertain really to the technical field personnel. So there's a handful of things that were some administrative things, and I'm going to kind of skip past them because they don't really pertain to this audience. And these are in no certain order, so I'm just going to kind of go from top to bottom real quick. Hopefully, you know, this stuff is pretty straightforward. If you do have questions or concerns, you know, raise them as I'm going through this. You're welcome to stop me. We can talk about it for a minute. And then same thing, if you're watching this later and you have more questions about this, just shoot me an email or give me a call. But the first one is we changed the language so that cost sharing most of the cost sharing should not be in the guidelines anymore. Basically, you should not be requiring landlords to do any cost sharing on anything. So as you can see, this section C51C, we changed the language. It used to say renters cannot be denied services or something, and we changed the language to say all of this, and then we deleted these other three sections. So all of this stuff that used to outline how a landlord had to be charged and whatnot, all of that's gone now. So the next line down is the same thing. It's just there was some stuff, so we were just doing away with the language requiring the owner cost share. If you get in the guidelines and you still see something about that, you know, feel free to let me know, and because we may have missed something, but the intent of the guidelines is that owner cost share is no longer required. Yeah, so, and that was all three of those lines there. There were some changes to section B5 as well. The other changes were, this one was really just, you won't really notice it, but the guidelines used to require that the SHPO documents were included in the intake file, and we moved the SHPO documents to be included in the audit file because the auditors are the ones that typically process that. I added a provision, so this line 19, we added a provision to allow the auditors to not have to evaluate to add insulation to a wall when the wall cavity is less than 2 inches deep. So it just simply says, since we do not have an effective method for insulating shallow cavities, if a wall cavity is uninsulated and less than 2 inches deep, an auditor can select none for the added insulation type, and note that there was no opportunity for improvement because the cavity was less than 2 inches deep. So auditors, if you're evaluating a wall and the cavity is not deep enough to, you know, if you try to blow insulation in there, it's just going to get kind of bunched up in the corner and we're going to have voids and stuff. There's really not an effective way to do it. I've now put it right in the guidelines so you have it in writing. It's okay to do exactly what it says there and to not evaluate to insulate that cavity. The next one was to clarify the expectation to establish a thermal and air boundary regardless of whether the duct outside the envelope is being used or not. To most of you, this one may kind of sound weird. What this is I've seen a few instances of this in the field in general. Most of the time I see this down on the Navajo reservation. We have a lot of mobile homes down there that they have a forced air furnace installed at the factory, but there's no propane or natural gas down on the reservation in some areas. So when they set the mobile home in place, they immediately install a wood stove so that they have a heating source. Well, now you have this ductwork system that is over time becomes very exposed to the elements, and the duct system, if it's outside the envelope, that really is part of your thermal boundary to the house. So all this is saying is basically, you guys ever run into this issue in the field, if you run into a home where there's more than one heat source that could be the primary heat source, you basically have to identify which one is going to be the primary heat source, and then your audit should reflect that, and you're going to stick with it. So in a house down on the Navajo reservation, if they've decided that the wood stove is going to be the primary source of heat, the auditors have to basically get rid of the duct system. So now they're doing their air sealing and their thermal insulation at the boundary of the house, and they're basically cutting the duct system out of the picture. So this was a new clause. I may have missed some stuff in there, but yeah, manufactured home on the reservation is primarily heated with the wood stove. Instead of sealing and insulating all the duct outside the envelope, the auditor could disable the furnace and insulate and seal off the duct at the thermal boundary of the home. So just be aware of that. I don't think it'll affect too many of you. The next one, this was to establish that the Weatherization Assistant user manual is also official guidance on how to use the audit. So it says that the most current version of the Weatherization Assistant user manual, that's that 700-page long manual. There's a link to it down here in section 7 if you need it. I think it's right there. So basically, it just added that to an official document that you should be referencing and using when you're trying to determine how to evaluate something on the audit. Line number 24 was about basement windows. As you can see, Utah Community Action requested that they have another option on how to evaluate windows. It used to the way the guidelines read last year, if you were going to evaluate basement windows, you had to create a separate wall, and you'd call it a basement wall. Anyway, they wanted to be able to enter the basement windows on the framed wall above instead of on the foundation wall only. And it really they just had a slightly different method of doing it, but it achieves the same purpose. So we've just added the ability to evaluate it in one of two ways. You either create a basement wall for the windows, or you can add them to the walls above. But if you add them to the walls above, you have to go and increase the total surface area of your walls above to reflect the window. So if the window is, if all the windows on the west side of the house are an additional 40 square feet, and your wood frame section of the west wall is 200 square feet, you have to go in and modify that and show that it's 240 square feet, and you have to make a note that the basement windows were included on the surface area of the wall. So anyway, if that's the way you'd like to evaluate them, you're welcome to do it that way. The next one down. The next 4 are all about the BPI 1200 standard. So we went in to the language on worst case draft spillage testing, and basically it says the test shall be conducted on every client home as part of the energy audit. The auditors shall follow the BPI 1200 standards. So the BPI 1200 standard is now in our guidelines, and it is a requirement. That's what you guys have been training on at the training center, but we'll be using that standard on all of this stuff. So combustion analysis, auditors shall use the BPI 1200 standard. Gas leak testing, use the BPI 1200 standard. In addition to all the guidance that's in our guidelines as well. And then just your So agencies shall conduct a thorough energy audit of the home. During the on-site visit, the auditor shall conduct all applicable inspections and tests using the BPI 1200 standard. When it comes to HVAC, that must be installed in accordance to manufacturer's spec and with the BPI 1200 standard, heat pumps, water heaters. So all of that stuff, the standard touches all of that stuff, and we've just made it required. So I think we're nearing the end of this. One of the last ones here was the attic access, the attic hatch. And this was a clause that we added, and the purpose of adding it was to make it required to insulate and air seal every attic hatch on the thermal boundary. So attic access, attic hatch, every attic hatch on the thermal boundary of a dwelling shall be air sealed and insulated to an R value similar to the rest of the attic. It should also have an insulation dam installed when necessary. Whenever possible, this should be addressed as part of an ECM or an IRM. If there are no associated ECMs, this measure shall be installed as an NAM. Many of you have been around long enough, and I'm going to say a naughty word, but it's the old O&M list, where we actually had just a list of measures we always did.
Don't dare say that word.
You could pretty much pretend that this is that. This is the measure that no matter what is going on in that house, you better be taking care of the attic access. So
Better wash your mouth out with soap, Turner.
yeah, I'll wash it out with a donut or something. How's that? But yeah, basically, most of the auditors have been addressing this, but as we come around, this is one of those where we won't even have to look at the audit. We'll just say, why didn't you address this attic access? It should have been done. So make sure that, especially auditors, that you're implementing that, but QCIs, be aware of it. If you're a field staff and you come across it and it's not on your work order, contact your auditor and talk to them about it. So this one says we were going to clarify, we're going to clarify that the auditor should never use the added R value field in the attic section of the audit. We talked about this 2 meetings ago, I think, but basically it's just the language before said something like should not use or something, and I had to go in and make the language a little stronger. It said should not enter anything into this added R value, and here it just says never use that added R value field. What it is, if you're evaluating an attic to add insulation, there's a couple of optional fields, and one of them is added R value. If you use that optional field for added R value, you put your thumb on the scale. It actually forces the audit to do that measure. So if you say that you're going to do an added R value of 10, the audit thinks that now that's a required measure, and we don't ever want to do that because it will push it right into your list of recommended measures, and sometimes it'll have an SIR below 1, and so you'll accidentally install that measure and you really didn't have an SIR to justify doing it. So hopefully that's clear. Does anybody have any questions on that one? I feel like we've covered it a few times, but if we need to talk about it more, we can. Or do you have any questions on anything that I just ran through? All right. Okay, so last month we did some guidance on foam plastics, and we got into the code. We read through some of the language of the code, and we learned that foam plastics basically have to be separated from the inside of the house by a thermal barrier. And then when it came to the ignition barrier, I didn't know enough about it, and I actually gave you guys bad guidance last month, which I'll hopefully clarify here. But we also left with a few unanswered questions. These are the questions that I left with from last month's training, and so I just wanted to go through them quickly and address them. And then I also have a kind of a quick reference guide that I created that I'm going to share with everybody, and hopefully these two things will kind of help us to better understand the foam plastic stuff. So we got into, basically, we have to separate all of our foam plastics from the interior of the house or from the livable areas of the house using drywall or 3/4 inch plywood or structural paneling. But when it comes to the attic, we were wondering, well, you know, where does this ignition barrier come in? So questions, one of the questions was, does exposed foam in an attic or crawl have to have an ignition barrier? The next one was, is fiberglass insulation an allowable ignition barrier? Number 3, does rigid foam on an attic access need an ignition barrier? So Dalton just talked about this, and we'll have to address that. Does 2-part foam on ductwork need an ignition barrier? And which products do not need an ignition barrier? So question number 1, does exposed foam in an attic or crawl have to have an ignition barrier? Does anybody remember what the requirements were for these attics or crawl spaces? There was kind of a couple of things going on there that you had to make sure that were happening or weren't happening.
You have to have wood or drywall as a thermal boundary.
Yeah. Wood or drywall is a thermal boundary. What about how's the space allowed to be used?
You can't use the space for something or other.
Yeah, basically, it's that if the homeowner's using the space to store anything, if it could ever be construed as livable space or as part of the interior of the home, then you can't. Then you have to have a thermal barrier. Basically, you'd have to have drywall covering all of the foam. So if it's a true attic where there's a small access, if there's a big giant door that goes into the attic, then it has to have the thermal barrier. But if it has a small, normal size attic access going into it, they're not using it for storage, it's only entered to maintain the equipment, then it's reasonable that this is now really outside of the livable space of the home. And what they've done in the code, they have the thermal barrier and then they have this ignition barrier, and the ignition barrier is the lesser of the two. And I think I have a slide or two where we'll go back over what the ignition barrier things can be, but they're all thinner than 3/4 of an inch of plywood or thinner than drywall. But still, they are there to keep fire from starting or from spreading too quickly. So I found a bunch of stuff that helped answer this question. This was one of them. So there's a Spray Polyurethane Foam Alliance, and in 2011 they put out this document called Thermal Barriers and Ignition Barriers or something like that. And in that document, I felt like their language there helped explain this pretty well. So it says, so their question was, where is a thermal barrier required? All model building codes require that SPF, or spray polyurethane foam, with some exceptions, be separated from interior living spaces by an approved thermal barrier. Therefore, unless an exception applies, all the interior SPF applications are required to be covered with a thermal barrier, covered with an equivalent thermal barrier, or be part of a tested alternative assembly. So they have to be covered with drywall or an equivalent thermal barrier, or the manufacturer has to pay a bunch of money and actually show that in that assembly they tested and met the fire requirements. So I guess someone besides the manufacturer could also pay for that, but anyway. So that's the main idea, is just we got to cover this foam plastic up from the interior of the home so that it doesn't cause a fire, it doesn't accelerate a fire, it's not a fire hazard. Where is an ignition barrier permitted? The IBC and the IRC permit the use of an ignition barrier as an alternative to installing a thermal barrier in attics and crawl spaces where entry is made only for repairs and maintenance or for the service of utilities. Therefore, in such attics or crawl spaces, SPF surfaces need not be covered with a thermal barrier, provided that it is covered with a prescriptive ignition barrier, or that it is part of an assembly that was tested in accordance with some of the fire testings and it was shown to be safe. So if it's not covered with the thermal barrier, it has to be covered with an ignition barrier, or it has to be shown to be tested to have met the fire standards or fire testing standards. So basically, this is saying that, yes, we have to put an ignition barrier on all of the foam in an attic or a crawl space. Also, so that was some Spray Foam Alliance that put that document together. I could not find anything that was really prescriptive in the code that would answer the question, but I did find, so the code is is it like International Code Council or something like that? So the folks that do the IBC and the IRC, the building code and the residential code, that is these guys, the ICC. And they have like a subsidiary that does these evaluation reports. So they have a smaller group of people that if you have a product, you're a manufacturer, you have a product, and when you read the code, you have a bunch of questions about how your product, you know, how the code would be applied to your product. You could submit them to this this group, the evaluation services group, and they will basically kind of put in writing how the code should be applied. Now, these guys have no authority, but the simple fact that they do this and they do it for the purpose of the industry, these reports are generally viewed as how the code should be applied. You could have a building inspector that doesn't.
That's not really how it works, Matt.
Oh, if you want to enlighten us, that's as far as I read on it. That's what I learned about it. But
Now, the manufacturers send things to the ES people to get it listed. The manufacturer has the burden to provide all the data showing that it conforms and complies with whatever standards it's being tested against. ICC issues an ES report, an evaluation report, saying that this product is listed under these very specific criteria and standards. But what you're trying to say is that when it comes down to the local jurisdiction administering the code for that area, there are allowances for them to not have to accept that evaluation report. 99% of the time they will accept the evaluation report as long as you're doing everything that the ES report says. But there are times that a jurisdiction will say, no, this is not being applied with the intent of that ES report.
That much better said than I was saying. I appreciate that. And yeah, exactly what Brad is saying. The manufacturer is actually having to submit all this stuff saying, look, we had this tested according to the fire test ratings, and these were the results and all of that stuff. So, but anyway, there's language for, so I went through the ES reports for all of the products that I sent out a thing to all of your coordinators and basically said, what foam plastics are you guys using? And then I went through all the ES reports for that. And the language, I've got this language here from just one of them, but the language was the same in all of them. And so you can see from this language that the intent of the code is that the foam plastic insulation cannot be exposed in an attic. And so this says, for this product, which is your the froth pack, the Dow froth pack, it says the ignition barrier must be, and this was the little section of this report where if you're going to put it in attics and crawl spaces, the ignition barrier must be consistent with the requirements of the applicable code, must be installed in a manner so that the foam plastic insulation is not exposed, The attic or crawl space area must be separated from the interior habitable space of the building by an approved 15-minute thermal barrier. So they're basically saying this part that's not exposed, it has to be installed with, you know, the ignition barrier to keep it from being exposed. So, and it's that language or something similar was in every one of these ES evaluation reports. So, so basically, to answer the question about whether or not we can put foam in the attics and crawl spaces, as a general rule, it has to have an ignition barrier. I'll show you in the chart. There's a few products that have been tested and have been shown that it's okay to install them without a thermal barrier. But as you can see from this drawing, like here's the interior of a home, and there's the red line represents the thermal barrier. But when we're up in an attic, there's, you know, it's not used for storage. It's just access for to service utilities or mechanical equipment. Then you do have to have an approved ignition barrier separating it, or basically covering it on all exposed sides. And same thing going on in the crawl. That green line is going to represent that. So the answer to question number 1 is yes, exposed foam in attic or crawl must have an ignition barrier or have specific approval. Question number 2, is fiberglass insulation an allowable ignition barrier? Last time we read through these 2 sections from the residential building code, and these are from the 2015 residential building code, and I did confirm yesterday that is what is the current adopted code in Utah. But we went through this stuff last time. As you can see, it has this list of ignition barriers, which was the 3.1 through 6 for crawl spaces and 3.1 through 8 for attics. So attics, they added cellulose and fiber cement paneling, but it's not listed for crawl spaces. But we had a question about, and I can't remember if it came up in the training or afterward, but 3.1 says 1.5 inches thick of mineral fiber insulation. But then nowhere in this list does it list off fiberglass. And I actually reached out to Owens Corning, and one of their technical reps there gave me a little bit of guidance because they were under the impression that mineral fiber insulation includes fiberglass. And I think they actually had a product that they were using the word mineral fiberglass. But
mineral fiber is either rock wool or firewool. Firewool is a trade name, but it's not fiberglass.
Here's what it got even messier. So this last screen is from. So we're reading in the Residential Code Chapter 3, so 316, right? Just a search for these terms, because they're using this weird term, mineral fiber insulation. If you look in other areas in Chapter 3, they actually have other areas where they've listed mineral wool or glass fiber. So it's like they're trying to make some differentiation between them. But it's basically just bad terminology.
Hey, Matt, it's rock wool. Real quick, do a Google search for rock wool and bring that up and show them what it looks like. It is something that's very prescriptive to fire protection and fire assemblies. It's not fiberglass. Trust me.
Okay. Well, here's the definition in the International Building Code, which is this term that they use, mineral fiber, and they're saying that is insulation composed principally of fibers manufactured from rock, slag, or glass with or without binders.
But this stuff is extremely dense. It's not like glass. It's got all that air in it. Like I said, if you bring it up, you'll see.
No, I understand, and I know what rock wool is. What we got hung up on was, what does this term mineral fiber insulation mean? Does that include fiberglass?
No, it does not.
All right. As you can tell, from what I found, I feel the opposite of what Brad is saying. So it's still an issue that you may run into this issue with building inspectors and stuff. So, yeah, I'm not sure how to move forward on that one, because basically what it comes down to is these are our options for ignition barriers. So in an attic, if we're going to put some foam plastics in the attic, then once we're done, we have to cover it with something. And in this case, they're saying it has to be mineral fiber insulation, a wood structural panel, particle board, hardboard, gypsum board, or steel in a crawl space. Or in an attic, they've added cellulose and fiber cement paneling. So the conclusion that I had come to was that yes, fiberglass would be an allowable insulation barrier, but the program manager is saying no, and we'll go with that. So back to the pictures of this. So here's an attic and here's a crawl space. What would we need to do if we ran across these situations in the field? In the video last month, we talked about this crawl space, and I basically said, is this allowable without an ignition barrier? So from what we talked about today, is that allowable without an ignition barrier?
No, it is not.
No, 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 and no.
And so what could we put on that as an ignition barrier?
Whatever's on that list on your previous slide.
Yeah. That being the case, though, so if this was a crawl space, what would you guys use if you had to put an ignition barrier on that?
I think the problem's going to be here is suddenly now you have to do two things instead of one thing. So why even put foam if you have to go through and re-insulate the foam that you just sprayed on the wall? So just use insulation in the first place. Well put.
Yeah, that's kind of the conclusion I came to as well, is that there's really not, it can't be used the way that we've seen in some areas used. And in this case, as I'm looking at this thing has a window and it's rather large, so this would probably be construed as not an attic, but more of a part of the living space, and you'd actually have to put drywall or 3/4 inch board on that, on the attic. But same thing there, if this was an actual attic and the window wasn't there, then you'd have to pick something from that list. And just as Scott said, if we're doing insulation stuff, you know, maybe we wouldn't opt for any foam plastics as part of an insulation measure. So do these examples need an ignition barrier? Answer is yes. We are coming up on 9 o'clock. I do have probably 10 more minutes worth of stuff, so if you need to drop off the line, you're welcome to. But I'll just keep going here. The sill plates and headers, there was one issue on this that is also questionable. So in the code says that foam plastic shall be permitted to be spray applied to sill plates and headers or installed in the perimeter joist space without the thermal barrier specified in section 316.4, subject to all the following. And it says the thickness of the foam plastic shall not be more than 3 1/4 inches thick. So again, this is all about fire, so if you have too much of this flammable stuff up there, it becomes a fire hazard. So they're limiting the thickness of it. It says the density of the foam plastic shall be in a range of 0.5 to 2 pounds per cubic foot. The foam plastic shall have a flame spread of 25 or less and a smoke development index of 450 or less. So and the question here was, do you know what the flame spread is for the products that you guys are using, and is it below the 25 and the smoke index below 450? And then also, you got to make sure you're under the 3 1/4 inches. But the plot thickens a little bit when you get into the fire testing on this stuff, because a lot of this a lot of these products were not tested at 3 inches thick. Most of them were only tested at 1 or 2 inches thick. And they did get that flame spread index. You know, they get the score below 25 and 450. But because they weren't tested at the actual thickness, you may run into some issues if you're applying it thicker than what it was tested at. So something to be aware of there, which kind of goes back to what Scott just mentioned. Like, you know, if you're installing this as insulation and then you have to cover it with other stuff, like what was the point of doing it? But in this instance, this spray foam is a really, really good air barrier. And so this may be an area where you apply 1 inch of foam and then you stick in an R13 bat and you end up with like an R19, you know, on the rim for not a lot of money. But question number 3, does rigid foam on an attic access need an ignition barrier? So Dalton just showed us the this picture, and we're gonna build our attic, our dam, the insulation dam up, and we're gonna put in a few layers of rigid foam. And from what we've been reading, it says that we can't have any exposed foam in the attic. So if we put this assembly together, do we have any exposed foam in the attic?
A little.
Where at?
On top of the dam.
Yeah. So do we have to put an ignition barrier around that foam? Any other thoughts from anybody besides Scott?
I would say yes.
Yeah, as far as I'm reading it, I can't find anywhere where there's an exception to not have an ignition barrier on an attic scuttle or a attic hatch. So if that's the case, what could we do to put an ignition barrier on this assembly here in the picture?
Just cut a piece of drywall that square and glue on top of it, I guess.
Yeah, that's the simplest approach we've come up with. It could get a lot more elaborate from there, but if you've built your insulation dam out of something that's thicker than a 1/4 inch wood paneling, because that's one of the ignition barriers listed for attics. So if this stuff's thicker than a 1/4 of an inch and it's supposed to stick up higher than the insulation here, and so, you know, make sure that it's also going to stick up higher than whatever R value you're adding here. But if that sits up higher than that and you put a 1/2 inch of drywall on top of your stack, then you should be, it's pretty much covered or it's not exposed anymore. So I think that's a pretty good solution to it, fairly inexpensive. So Dalton just showed a couple pictures of the knee wall attic accesses where they're gluing rigid foam on the back of those doors. That assembly might be a little more problematic because if you glue drywall to the back side of it, you may still have exposure on the sides of that. And I don't have great answers for that stuff right now. But yes, rigid foam on an attic access, if it's exposed foam in an attic, it has to have an ignition barrier. Does 2-part foam on ductwork need an ignition barrier?
Yes.
Yeah, so if this stuff's in an attic, what could we use for an ignition barrier?
Well, again, this is where you're going to run into an issue because we've been doing this forever, and it even says it in the weatherization guide. But if we have to wrap that in fiberglass insulation, then there's just no sense in even spray foaming it anymore.
Yeah. If this ductwork was going to be covered in cellulose, one of the allowable ignition barriers is 1.5 inches of cellulose. So if you knew that it was going to be covered in that, then you'd be okay. But again, like if it's going to be covered in cellulose, why are you spray foaming it, right? As far as insulation. Now, could you use some spray foam to air seal duct?
Yeah, but it's not as good as mastic.
Yeah, I like that, and the manufacturers actually have limitations. You can only go like 3 inches wide, and you can make a strip as long as you want, but it can only be 3 inches wide, or you can make a strip that's 6 inches wide, but it's limited to like 18 square inches per foot or yard or something like that. So you can use it as an air sealing material, but if you're covering entire surfaces, it has to have an ignition barrier. And so yeah, I don't see a way around this one either. As far as I can see, we probably shouldn't be using spray foam to insulate our ducts.
What if we go into a house that already has it? Because once in a while we'll run into a house that has foam somebody else has done before.
Yeah. That's a good question, because it really could fall into a health and safety issue. I think if we don't touch it, we probably want to leave it alone. If you have a code inspector that gets hung up on it, then the health and safety guidance would allow you the leverage to address it. And you could cover it with some sort of an ignition barrier. This is where the issue comes in, though, is if fiberglass is not an allowable ignition barrier, then we don't really have too many great options. I guess, well, maybe it's that I don't know the options. Maybe there's a bunch of mineral wool stuff out there that we just haven't been using because we're so used to buying the fiberglass stuff. But
well, your silverback duct wrap's not really rock wool. It's more just, I know it's gray, but it's fiberglass. It's not rock wool. So, I mean, what would be the difference between wrapping a foam sprayed duct with duct wrap after you spray it with foam, or a wrap just not spraying it with foam? You're still got fiberglass insulation on there.
Well, in one case, you insulated the duct with some silverback duct wrap, but in the other case, you had some foam that needed an ignition barrier, and you have to use one of those prescribed ignition barriers in order to cover it. So yeah. Which products don't need an ignition barrier? So I don't know if you guys can see this very well on your screen, but I'm going to email this out with the link to the video and stuff. I basically went through and grabbed most of the products that we're using in our program right now. So I looked at some foam boards, the 2-part foam, and some 1-part foam. And I tried to go through and I looked at what they were tested at, and basically how we can or cannot use them in our program. This first section is like, can we use Owens Corning as attic insulation? And you can see that you can go up to 3 inches without an ignition barrier. They have passed all the fire tests, and they have submitted to the ICC and shown that their product meets the standards, and you can go 3 inches thick without an ignition barrier. The Dow styrofoam, you can only go 2 inches. The Dow Thermax, you can go 4 1/4 without an ignition barrier. But the problem with this is a polyiso, which is, if I'm not mistaken, can be more flammable than this XPS stuff. But they've got foil facers on it, so it passed the fire tests. But the edges of this, if the edges of this are exposed, then those have to be covered with a thermal barrier. So even this product is not, the magic answer to some of the problems. And this is one, I haven't actually seen anybody using this, but it was, as I was researching, I found this was one that actually you could go a little thicker. And then the Dow Tough R, you can go 1 inch. So really the main point is know your products, because as you can see just from a couple of different XPS products, they have different ratings on them based on how the manufacturers tested them. So just because you've been using 2 inches and you've been okay in the past, if you start buying this product, it was really only tested up to 1 inch and you shouldn't be using it. I doubt anybody's going to get into the nitty-gritty with you, but be aware, we really need to be, we are the experts in this. We need to be doing this stuff right. Your Dow froth pack, your 2-part foams, basically, as you can see all the way down the list, they have to have a thermal barrier, and they were only tested up to 2 inches thick, so you can't go any thicker on them. So they have to have an ignition barrier and be less than 2 inches thick. If you do the interior insulation, that's the basement, so yeah, it has to be. The seal box insulation, this is one where, so if we're spraying it on the rim, this product was tested up to 3 inches, so I think 3 1/4 we were okay. Actually, that one might be questionable. But notice this one again, whoops. This tough stuff, or tough R, this did not have the flame spread below 25, so if your guys were cutting that in between floor joists and sticking that up, that shouldn't be there because it didn't meet the flame spread requirements. So the other ones did. The foams were tested up to 2 inches thick, so you could spray that stuff up there. This one, the DAP Touch and Seal, they did get approval, or they submitted to the ICC and showed that if you did the DAP Touch and Seal, plus they tested it with 3 different brands of intumescent coatings, that assembly together passes the need, or passes the fire tests. So if you installed it with this intumescent coating, then you could go 2 inches thick. The problem with the intumescent coating is that it is very, very specific. It has to be 20 mils thick. It has to be applied in a couple of coats that are no more than like 5 or 10 mils thick, and I could see that being problematic for our program. But I put it up there because I don't want you guys to stop thinking outside the box. If we can find some creative solutions, we'd love to see them. But and then also note that, like, they have 3 very brand specific products, not just brand specific, but like very specific products that have to be used. Those are the only 3 that they tested in conjunction with their product. So you couldn't use some off-name brand to do that with. And then I also looked at the handy foam and the great stuff and found just really, you can see you can use them on the seal box, but then they're really not applicable as an insulation. It really gets down into air sealing. But I've tried to give some guidance on how the products can be used as an air sealer as well. So anyway, so hopefully that stuff will be a little bit of a help or a guide. In conclusion, these were the kind of the 3 conclusions I drew from all of this. The foam insulation can rarely be installed alone. It either requires an ignition barrier or it requires foam plus another insulation to cost effectively meet the energy code. So even if it's not an ignition barrier, we really shouldn't be just putting gobs of spray foam on something. We really should be looking at spraying like 1 inch of foam as the air barrier and then adding some R-value with something cheaper, just because that would be the most cost-effective thing to do. And along this, in this same note, bear in mind something that Dalton covered earlier with the intent of insulating everything we're doing is to bring it up to the current energy code. So if you're evaluating a basement wall, the goal is to get it to the current energy code if it's cost effective. And so if we're doing 2 inches of spray foam on a rim and getting an R10, you really should be evaluating that for like an R19. So you really should be looking at doing 1 inch of foam and some R13 bats or something, and figuring out which of these methods is the most cost effective to actually get that as close as possible to the energy code. So yeah, foam can rarely be installed alone. Foam for air sealing does not require ignition barriers as long as it falls within the manufacturer's specs. And I apologize, I didn't really go into that. I'll let you guys do that on your own time, but it's just down here. It just shows like the max of 1 inch and 5/16 thick and 3 inches wide and 18 square inches exposed. Like there's some specific stuff depending on the spray foam that you're using. that you need to be cognizant of how much foam you're leaving exposed. But that stuff actually can be left exposed to the interior. It should not be exposed to sunlight though, so be aware of that. And then the last thing, the seal box insulation is up to 3 1/4 inches thick, is not clear. If the product's flame tread and smoke dev are not tested at that thickness, you really can only safely install to the thickness that was tested. So, and then really the 2-part on duct will probably go the way of the dodo, and we need to figure out how to put ignition barriers on our attic scuttles. So I know that was a ton of stuff. Does anybody have any questions or concerns that haven't been addressed yet? All right. Thank you guys for attending. Thanks for hanging on the line with us. We went over time a lot more than I like to. I'll try not to do that again. But I'll send out a link to this video, so hopefully it can be used as a resource in the future. And you guys have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Are not for situations involving residential and not involving situations where the foam plastic is being used as insulation. It's where it's being used in exterior stucco applications and things like that. That's commercial